morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where in the world you're joining us from. Welcome to our expert panel, Strategic Synergy, Elevating Business Decisions with Executive Data Science and Generative AI, brought to you by our friends at Matillion, Snowplow, Sqream, and Tecton. I'm Brian Mink, co-founder and president of Data Science Connect, the world's largest data and AI community. Today, we're excited to welcome hundreds of attendees from all over the world to discuss how generative AI and data science are reshaping executive decision-making. Gen AI is already revolutionizing how organizations operate, streamlining tasks, cutting costs, and speeding up processes. But what's next? How can companies leverage data to drive decision-making, inform executive decisions, and elevate outcomes at every level, from operations to the C-suite? In this webinar, we'll take a deep dive into that question and more, in what's sure to be a lively conversation with our expert panel. I'm excited to introduce our distinguished panel of experts today. Yaniv, Field CTO at Sqream, David Wang, VP of Marketing at Tecton, Reid, Senior Product Manager at Snowplow. Before we begin, a few housekeeping items. To make this feel a little more in person, we suggest you add a photo to your profile and include your bio, LinkedIn profile, and other information you'd want your fellow attendees to see. Next, please take advantage of the Q&A and chat features throughout the talk. We're dedicating a portion of the end to Q&A, so be sure to upvote the questions you'd like the panel to address. If you're wondering where your organization stands compared to others on your AI journey, check out the poll question in the right sidebar. And finally, to learn more about how Gen AI and data science and executive decision-making, check out the calls to action below throughout the webinar from our sponsors. Now, without further ado, let's kick off our panel. I'd like to welcome all of our panelists to the stage. Welcome, everyone. And we'll start with some quick 30-second introductions. Just kind of go around the horn and tell everyone in the audience about yourselves and your organizations, a little bit more about what you do. So I'll start with the way you guys appear on my screen. So let's start with John.
Hi, everyone. I'm John, Senior Product Manager at Snowplow Analytics. I lead our digital analytics team, which is focused on building self-service data applications for end users to answer questions about their data, and also leading our internal Gen AI initiative.
Excellent. David?
Hey, good morning, good afternoon, everybody. My name is David, and I'm the Vice President of Marketing at Tecton. If you're not familiar with Tecton, Tecton is a company, it's an AI infrastructure company that founded in 2018. And our focus in life is really about helping companies productionize AI applications by solving like the biggest bottleneck, which is all about activating data for better models and better predictions. And so we have a platform that makes it very simple for engineering teams to abstract away all of the underlying data engineering that's required to turn raw, unstructured, structured data into all of the input signals and features and context that's necessary to power like really cool intelligent experiences like Rexes and fraud detections and other cool use cases like that.
Awesome. Thanks, David. Yori.
Hi, Yori Levy. I'm Field CTO for Sqream. I'm in my background, I've been with enterprise data for the last few decades. I sold a company to CompuWare, another company I found I sold to SAP. And Sqream deals with enabling data. So really large data set, anything that won't fit into your memory, to companies that use 25 petabytes and run over 1 million ETLs a day. And anything from managing the data to getting doing AI training on a full production set. So kind of pushing the limits on how do you actually get data into an insight.
Great, thanks, Yori. And John, I know you wanted to give a quick intro to Snowplow as well, so go ahead there.
Yeah, sorry, forgot that first time round. So I work at Snowplow, which is the leading customer data infrastructure platform. So it's a way of collecting AI-ready data and either building real-time use cases on top of it or streaming it into the warehouse and then building analytics on top of that.
Excellent. Well, thanks all of you for the great introductions and welcome. Looking forward to a great conversation. I want to get to our first question, which is, we've we talk a lot about Gen AI. There's obviously a lot of hype around it. There's also a lot of really exciting developments that are truly transformative. And so I think one of the key questions for today is, how can Gen AI enhance an organization's existing AI, ML, data science capabilities, particularly in helping to generate insights that are more actionable for executives? So why don't we go in reverse order this time, and Yori, if you want to kick us off there.
Sure. Although everybody deals when you say AI today, Gen AI is the leading thing. My experience says that ML is actually the most common being used today. So I think there are actually two flavors to your question. How can people actually get an insight, actionable insight, prediction, and the biggest data source in enterprise today is structured enterprise data. Structured enterprise data, you can't really feed into a Gen AI and get a result. We're getting a little bit closer, but we're really far away. So if you need a lot of data, a lot of insight on your core data, that's still machine learning. And the challenges there today is they're actually organizational. It takes forever to develop a model and put it into production. You need data engineering, you need data scientists. Data engineer report to somebody else. 80% of ML modeling is actually data prepping. When you are testing on a small part. If you have 30 terabyte data, you do the training on a 50 gig, on 100 gig. That dimensionality reduction take weeks to months to do. So basically, it's an organizational thing on how to do. We need to get to the point where you want a model, you have the data, and it'll take you a few days to deploy it in production. It's the scale, it's the skill set, and it's tools that enable you to actually take this model into production and have people use that. So that's about ML. These are things that prevent people from using today. On Gen AI, I think that the hype is still really high, and the quality is the biggest issue that prevents people from actually deploying. Hallucination. If you're talking about RAG, RAG is supposed to decrease hallucination. How sure are you can deploy? And I'm not even talking regulation. I'm just talking about usage and get the right amount of data. So these are the key things that are kind of slowing people in adopting and actually using, getting insight, actionable decision at the right time for enterprises.
Yeah, great points. David?
Yeah, this question is really intriguing to me because when I look at this question here, I'm thinking about, like, how can generative AI augment the work that's typically done in a more manual curation type format to create insights? Because I think we can all agree that insights is quantitative analysis, right? It's about understanding trends. It's about understanding what's happening. It's looking at historical data, and like Yori mentioned, it's typically involving structured data analysis, right? So what we're seeing and hearing from our customers is there's a whole world of data that lives out there that's actually unstructured in nature, right? If LLMs and natural language processing is really good at qualitative analysis, and machine learning, reporting, BI is really good at structured quantitative analysis, and there's this whole treasure trove of unstructured data, there's a huge opportunity for folks using generative AI and language models to actually create structure from unstructured data. And that's what we're seeing at Tecton from our customers. And so if I show an example, for example, like e-commerce, like imagine like the four of us were in an e-commerce business today, and we're thinking about our site, and we have thousands of product reviews. We can take that unstructured data of product reviews, and we can actually create structure. We can actually extract information that would be highly insightful. This would be things like sentiment. What's the sentiment? Positive, negative? How's it trending? And this would be like classification of aspects of the product. Like, what do things people like? What are characteristics they like? What are things they don't like? What are issues that are existing about the product? And then you can take all of that information that now has been structured because of language models, and now you can actually do things with it. You can do reporting with it. And more importantly, in my mind, is that the ultimate utopia state is take that structured data that came from an unstructured source and actually drive like real-time predictions, real-time recommendations out of it. And so if we think back at like our kind of core machine learning models, like think about like churn prevention, think about recommendation engines. Like it's all about context that makes those models highly performant and successful. So now we can take Gen AI, use it to actually translate that unstructured data into structured features and vectorized embeddings, and then put that as input into those models. And then you're going to have a much more enriched model that's going to perform much better in the real world. And that's actually what Tecton is doing. We actually announced just yesterday our ability to completely abstract this process associated with creating model generated features that can be used as input signals into your models for prediction time. So it's something that a lot of companies and folks are talking to us about. How do they incorporate these kind of new signals?
Yeah, really, really great points, I think, David, about the revolutionary aspect of being able to transform a lot of unstructured data that right now is untapped and turning into something structured that can be much more effectively leveraged. John, what are your thoughts?
Cool. So I agree very much with what the other panelists have said. I think we've found something in line. I'll take it in a slightly different direction, which is, I think having a Gen AI is increasingly becoming like having a really good, dedicated junior analyst. So I think the lowest hanging fruit for executives is, I think, using Gen AI to help answer questions about their data, to something that would have taken weeks because the request would have to go into a queue. They can now just generate the SQL themselves, and more importantly, not just get the answer, but help to interpret it or understand it. So I've seen execs in our org and also in other orgs like actually use Gen AI as a sounding board, saying, hey, like, this is what the data is saying. This is what I think we should do. What do you think? And it sounds almost a little bit fake or artificial, but actually LLMs are quite good at that sort of, they kind of back and forth, the more like fuzzy business type conversations, and then supplemented by actual real hard data that they're generating from the, from your data warehouse or your data store.
Yeah, great points. And I think that leads us nicely to our next question. To what extent do you guys see Gen AI as really enhancing capabilities? And I think about use cases like what David talked about, where this is something that wasn't happening at all before, right? Sentiment analysis of customer reviews, for instance, in the e-commerce context. Like maybe that's an example of an enhanced capability where we're doing something that previously wasn't able to be done, didn't make sense to do if you had to have humans do it manually. Versus what are sort of operational efficiencies, what are things where maybe we're able to use Gen AI for something that humans were doing previously, and maybe now they're just doing it a little bit better, faster, or cheaper. So how do you see kind of the distinction between those two, and where do you think are some areas where maybe we will see more enhanced capabilities as opposed to just operational efficiencies? Who wants to take that one first?
I'll start us off. Hey, Brian, I can start us off. I think that the delineation between net new value creation versus operational efficiencies is pretty intriguing. I'll take it from the former first and really think about like net new value creation. If you think about like every business, like literally every company, every business thinks about how they can differentiate, how they can be more competitive, how they can grow faster. And we tend as businesses have envy of others, right? Like we all want to be making as much money as Google. We all want to have recommendations that are as good as Amazon or Netflix. We all want to be able to prevent fraud in the way that Stripe or Plaid can prevent fraud at a global scale. And I think what's really intriguing to me is that generative AI can unlock net new use cases that most organizations today have not been able to do. Like Tecton has been in this business of helping power fraud detection systems and recommendation systems for the last 5 years. A lot of companies have done it, but the scale by which generative AI has done to normalize getting models into the real world, it's like night and day difference, because formerly to do machine learning, you're going to have to train those models in-house. And now that level of training and the pre-training has already happened, where general knowledge is accessible, general really strong effective models are accessible because of everything that's happening in our ecosystem. So the question now is, how do we drive differentiated value? And I think what's intriguing to me is this notion of real-time personalization. Like if you were to think and interact with a chatbot as an example, right? Chatbots are very popular. Question answers are very popular. But let's like put in an example of like a travel agent. If we were to call a travel agent today and we would know that, right? This travel agent knows us really well. And we're going to call them and say, hey, where should I go for vacation? They're going to talk to us and they're going to say, oh, I know this about you. I know this about you. I know this about you. And therefore you should go to this destination. But if you were to ask an LLM today, where should I go for vacation? It'll probably just say, because it uses similarity search and understands where things happen, and it'll say Paris. But, oh, Paris is actually not good this time of year. Oh, I don't actually like French food. Oh, I actually like this other cuisine instead. And so the opportunity is actually to create tremendous amount of value if we can drive personalized experiences like an Amazon, like a Netflix, and do that at scale across businesses. And even PwC recently wrote a report that said by 2030, we should see $5 trillion in net accretive GDP because of hyper-personalization. And I think generative AI and language models play a really important role in that. And I think that's what's really excited for me in terms of like the net new value creation from this.
Cool. Yeah, I'll jump on after that. Yeah, definitely see huge opportunities for new types of insights. And I think what's so interesting about Gen AI is it can really turn a company's proprietary data into their single biggest asset. I mean, that's always been the case for structured data. But now, if you're a company that's sitting on huge amounts of images or audios, even like videos, you can actually extract more value from that. So one example I came across recently, one of our customers is a vacation homes provider. And they've started to add like micro features to their product search. So, when you list a home, you put the very basic facts about it and then some photos. And they can now do things like, if you want to search for a property with a full length mirror, that's like really specific, but they can actually search the photos and they've pre-computed some of those features. And it feeds very much into what David was saying. They're able to provide a much more personalized experience for their customer, because they've almost like created structure out of this previous just huge treasure trove of images. I will say that it's worth starting with simpler and more internal use cases. Like everyone wants to do the fancy stuff, but we've seen basically there's kind of an AI maturity and adoption curve, and it makes most sense to start out with internal use cases where you can evaluate the quality, where you can make changes and improvements, and not put something in front of customers that may lead to inaccurate or misleading results.
I actually have I don't disagree with anything that was said, but I have a completely different take on how and where to use Gen AI. And it starts with the fact that each tool fits a specific task. So you need to understand what makes Gen AI effective. So obviously it starts with what data you have and the quality of the data. And Gen AI works, and I'm putting video and audio and pictures aside. I'm talking about mostly text. That's the more common use today for enterprises. So if you have something that you need an intelligent assistant to go through and understand, okay, somebody asked if this thing is covered by a policy. Somebody needs to go through hundreds of pages of pages of policies and figure out stuff, that's a really great case for a Gen AI, because the raw data is text, and it's not just text, it's complex with a lot of context. And when I'm asking something about understanding what I'm asking and mapping and matching the right context within a really large data set of text, that's a great thing to do. So anything where today you have kind of a semi-manual process that somebody need to understand a lot of knowledge that's conveyed in policies, in text, in documents, in text, figuring sentiment, that's a really good use case. And it's not only a really good use case, it's scalable. Because if we put a human on that, that's not scalable. Having a team of 2,000 people going and figuring out, okay, what's the sentiment? Is something brewing here? That's not scalable. Having a few hundreds of people master a few thousand documents of policy, guaranteed they're not going to understand it the same way, and you are going to have a very hard time reaching I'm not even saying a good, just consistent response. So these are places where today Gen AI excels. Okay, and I'm putting hallucination a little bit aside. You can put some people to verify. You can do RAG to ground the results. Far from perfect, but much better, by the way, than the manual approach. So if the first thing we're asking is where Gen AI can help, is where you have the data, and the data actually fits Gen AI. Text, a lot of it, complexity, and people want to understand kind of summarize this in a really good way. And there are a lot of these. We actually see that. The places where Gen AI is not touching today, and I wish that it could, and Sqream is actually doing a lot of work on trying to do that, is take structured data, and that's more vision, that's more future. It's not something now, it's something we're testing, but the more I talk with people, I hear that more. If you can have an intelligent discussion with a bot that understands your structured data, the things that happened 15 minutes ago, and it can answer you, that'll be great. Now, the level that it exists today, and it's important to understand, I used to define Google as the best search engine that find an answer to questions that have one answer. What is the temperature somewhere? What is, and there is a specific answer. ChatGPT and LLMs give you a summarized answer that's qualitative, and it's not a single answer. By the way, if you ask the same question 5 times, you'll get 5 different answers, similar, but different. Okay. I'd like to have that ability on structured data. And what you have today with LLMs is you have tools or stuff that can get you what Google used to tell you before. You can get structured data, but not at the LLM level, at old Google. Give me what are the sales. It can figure that out. But ask it, what are the causes that the sales are declining? No idea. And that's really what you want to do. The same level we understand context, complex text, we'd like LLM to understand structured enterprise data. And to me, that's the biggest untapped market, much more than what we just described, that people would really want to have that, but still not available today. So I know I took this a little bit more to what they're doing, but what I wish they could be doing. It's extending the question a little bit, but I think it's an interesting perspective.
Yeah, I don't think we're that far off, actually, Yori. I think there's some really interesting developments in terms of like knowledge graphs and semantic search, where basically you tell the LLM what data you have in your warehouse, what data points you've captured, how they've been generated. So like a whole metadata layer. So then use that as an input into your queries. So
I think that's okay. There are a lot of these. What they're trying to do, they try to make sense of the column names, of what does a column means. Okay, and if I understand the column, maybe I can create context. Now, the problem with that is when you go to real applications, you go to a manufacturing environment. I have a customer, they have 2 million columns. I guarantee there is no way to actually get a meaningful understanding of what each column does. Or if you look at an Oracle Fusion that looks at CRM, they have 50 to 70,000 columns when you retrieve that. So whenever you come to an actual scenario where you have a few hundreds to a few thousands of columns, there is no easy way to understand what a column means. Okay, and a lot of the in different tables you'll have same name of a column with a little bit different meaning. So there is no easy way to actually infer this. You need somebody to really understand and add this. And that part is, at least today, is not doable. What you are describing, I absolutely agree. There are a lot of places where you can feed it a schema, and it'll actually try to figure out what each column means, and based on that, do inference. I think that's a demo level. That's not even a POC level. I think in a real use case scenario where you have hundreds and thousands of columns, and a normal person actually isn't actually able to explain all of that, we're still really far away from that. I wish we were closer, but we're still not there.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're getting onto the challenges here. Like, I think it is becoming possible. As I agree, it's not plug and play today, but I think we see organizations making a lot of investments in like data catalogs and knowledge graphs to solve exactly this problem. And LLMs are still useful even on a subset of the data. So maybe not all 2 million columns, but the few hundred or the few thousand are your key metrics.
Absolutely. I mean, we're trying to resolve this in a completely different way. The part that actually can take individual rows and create context out of them is good old machine learning, plain ML. You take an ML, you create a model, you do some explainability, and then somebody can say, hey, in this case, this row, the market is going to be 10. It indicates the market is going to be 10% higher in a week, and it can tell you why because of explainability. So you can actually create context based on raw data, but using ML. So it's not completely automatic, but I think that there is a way even today to start doing that. But I think that Gen AI needs some help creating the context on something that's completely contextless. And but I absolutely think it's feasible. I absolutely think we're less than a year away from a mature solution.
And this gets to a good question here from Shiva in the chat of how can we define that Gen AI is far better than a human being with years of experience? Gen AI is only learning through pattern recognition if it's an LLM. And can we make calls which are important for business growth on that basis? So I think what Shiva's getting at is this question of, how do we know when good enough is good enough, right? I mean, obviously there are hallucinations. There are some things associated with Gen AI and LLMs where they're not producing perfect outputs. And I think, one way of dealing with that perhaps is to start with certain use cases that are maybe have a lower risk associated with them, or their internal use cases where you can sort of validate some of these things before you send them into production in a way that's customer facing. So that could potentially be one type of solution, but is there some kind of systematic way where we can really evaluate, the outputs that Gen AI is giving us and whether those are good enough to make strategic decisions based on? Who wants to start with that one?
I can start. First, I think that's a valid question because you can see the amount of effort spent on trying to solve it. The whole idea of fine-tuning a model to kind of figuring out better on how to come up with an answer. the whole idea of RAG that tries to come up with an answer and then ground it based on things that are verified. So the fact that we're spending the industry spend a lot of research to try and do that, that means it's an actual problem. Now, I think that the question is actually a question of credibility. So it's not just hallucination. It could be just a wrong answer. Everything you look at data, and the data you have two articles that describe one way to do this, and 1,000 articles that describe a different way to do it differently. Which one is the right one for what somebody asked? Now, it's not a simple answer. There is no. It's not statistics. It's not an easy answer to say. Meaning, it doesn't have to be hallucination. How valid is the answer? In ML, this is solved by trying to get explainability. Don't show me how you reached it, but describe to me in terms I understand what supports it. So I think that similar techniques will evolve here. And the question at the end is, if you rely on Gen AI, you should develop a better way to monitor the credibility of an answer. And today, by the way, I think it's an open question. I don't think it's an answered question. So if you want to relegate strategic decision where the cost of an error is strategic, you probably shouldn't do it until you have a better way of assessing credibility.
I would add a slight kind of another point of view in addition to what Yori's saying, is that when we think about traditional machine learning, there's some like philosophical software engineering best practices that apply in this world of generative AI responses as well. And that's where we think of CI/CD, continuous improvement, continuous delivery, and the feedback loop that's associated with getting responses. I think when we think about hallucinations and the opportunity for LLMs to be, off their rocker, we have to provide context, right? We have to have the right data. We have to be able to provide an environment where it's structured. You have user inputs, you have characteristics that provide really important signals to curate that response, but you got to be able to test it. You're not just taking it at face value. You're still actually creating an environment where you're training against events, you're training against your context, you're training against the responses that an LLM generates. And then before you put it into production, you're actually looking at that training data. You're deriving point in time accurate, training sets that actually is a philosophical approach of the traditional machine learning world. But point in time accuracy is super key because it's aligned with data quality. What is the input signals? What is their response? And how do you actually determine the right deterministic response based on what actually has happened historically? And that's how you can improve that model accuracy. And so same principles that applied over the last 10 years on traditional machine learning has to apply here in generative AI as well. And that's going to help data quality. It's going to help on responses. It's going to help on hallucinations.
Yeah, I'd agree. And I'd say it's actually quite similar to the overall product development process. So I'd say for orgs that are starting a new AI initiative, firstly, set a goal with some measurable business impact. It sounds really obvious and is also incredibly easy to mess up or to even just forget to do. I think we do see there's a massive hype train at the moment. I'm hoping that we've reached the peak of the hype curve and we're actually going to get into the good stuff now. But just beware of AI for AI's sake. Those types of projects are beloved by executives or board members, and if you can't actually tie it to a real business problem, it's probably not going to go anywhere. I'd say the second thing that's really helpful here is benchmarking. So ideally, and this is actually how all the LLM providers train their models, right? Or at least evaluate them against each other. There's a reference set of questions and then answers, and you see how well the LLM does according to the test set. So you can easily make your own set of internal benchmarks, have a human do the same task that an LLM will do, and then check, how well is my system doing, and then that gives you a target to improve against.
Yeah, great points. And John, I'll jump off of one point that you just made about making sure that Gen AI aligns with the business outcomes and that it's not just another shiny object. So that's, I think front of mind for a lot of folks who are working with Gen AI right now is you're getting pressure from senior executives, sometimes even the CEO or board of directors of publicly traded companies who are saying, what are we doing with Gen AI? Why are we behind our competitors on this? Tell me how we're moving the needle right now on this. And so how do you make sure that these Gen AI use cases that you're tackling do align with the business goals of the organization, that they actually move the needle from a strategic standpoint, that they actually align with broader organizational objectives? And I'll add one kind of wrinkle to that as well, is how do you coach these executives that come to you that maybe are not as sophisticated in their understanding of Gen AI and of data? How can data executives coach their senior business executives and say, look, here are the things that we're focusing on, and here's why we're focusing on them, because these are actually strategic priorities as opposed to just something cool that someone thought would be a good idea, right? So how do you make that distinction, and how do you communicate that to your senior executives? Who wants to start on that one?
I want to share a statistic I heard from a Databricks executive a few days ago. They said 80% of Gen AI projects fail. Fail in the sense that they are not even coming close to originally what they tried to solve. So I think the answer to what you said is not technical at all. I think it's educational and organizational. Going back to Gen AI is not for everything, but for the things you have the data and it's the right thing, it could be really great. I would add one more thing. You need to define very clearly what's the business impact you're looking for, what problem you want to solve, because it's not just a tool, it's a very fine tool. It's if you're not aiming it in the right direction, if you're not training it correctly, if the things you want to ground the result with the right data set, it's either not going to solve, or people will lose trust, which means it's going to fail, or it's not going to answer the right thing. So it's extremely powerful, but it's not the be all end all. So it starts with have a discussion with whoever asks you, why are we not there? On beside visibility, we want to have the aura of an advanced organization that use LLM. Okay, let's put this aside. Beside that, what do you think we're trying to solve? If you try to actually anchor the discussion in a specific business value, then you can go back and say, yeah, it's a good fit, but we don't have the data. We need to develop the data. Or it's not a good fit. We need a different approach for that. It starts with disappointment starts when you have a difference between execution and expectation. So if you want to avoid disappointment, start with setting up the right expectations here.
Yeah, I want to round out that answer. I think impact is important, but ultimately what you care about is return on investment, which means you also have to account for the cost or the resources that are involved in shipping a project. So these tools can be quite expensive, right? If you're running the latest version of ChatGPT's thing on thousands or millions of rows, like you're quickly going to rack up the expenses. And you can often use smaller, cheaper local models to get the cost down. But there's definitely a non-zero cost associated with prototyping and building out these models. And it should fall under the same prioritization framework that all your company initiatives sit under. I'll say also it's quite important to set the expectation that the decision for how something will be implemented should rest with the technical team who's building it, because often, as Yori has said before, traditional ML works fine. It works great. In fact, it's even better or cheaper. So we've been building out like predictions and a forecasting tool for time series data, and we had an exec being like, "Oh, can we use OpenAI for that?" And we had to say no, like that's not the right model for the task. We can just use some regression model, and that'll be a lot faster and a lot cheaper. So I think understand the problem, try and measure what the potential positive impact is, and then the cost, and then kind of rank these projects accordingly.
For me, I would piggyback off of something that Yori said when he talked about the identification of use cases. And what I would add to that is it's the identification of a high valued use case. That's obviously really important, right? Is it a customer interaction? Is it an internal business process that we're trying to optimize? But you have to also set the right KPIs accordingly, technical KPIs. Like, what's the conversion? If we're going to be building out a recommendation service, we need to have the right KPIs so we're able to monitor against. Because the last thing we want to do is put a cool chatbot onto our website and have zero conversion. Well, yes, the board got their answer that we implemented LLMs, but it didn't actually make any difference for the business. So it's not just identification or setting what is the KPI and the ROI, but it actually goes into the technical implementation that's required. Like, that is really, really, really hard. And that's the blocker. Like, Tecton has seen this over the last 5 years. Our founders created Uber Michelangelo. It was like the ML platform that's powering like every interaction touch point at Uber. But the difficulty of system integration, the difficulty of data engineering, the resources and human power that's required to build these very sophisticated data pipelines and feature pipelines to power these models, it's not for the faint of heart. And I think it also, to get this impact, requires executives having like a realization of, and this is so interesting for me because I see this all the time talking to customers. We have some customers that try to build this very sophisticated integrated system data engineering platform themselves, hit a blocker, realize that they can't process streaming data effectively. They're having data freshness issues or data quality issues. They get blocked. They call up Tecton to help me. But then you also see another group of people that say, hey, you know what? I know that's going to be really, really hard to do. And so instead of going through that tech debt and accumulating that tech debt, I'm actually just going to start off the right track and look at the right tooling that's going to help me go faster. And with more accuracy. And I think from a technical executive point of view, kind of ideally take a time to pause for a moment and say, hey, what's the right approach here? Like, is there tooling that could do some level of abstraction for me? Do I want to build all of this from scratch? Because there are really cool tools out there that could actually help drive a level of efficiency that will make like the end outcome much more attainable.
Yeah, and David, I think that leads to a really good point that VJ has made in the chat as well with this question here is, how do you suggest deciding between homegrown Gen AI modeling, and I'll expand on that as well, not just Gen AI, but other ML models or anything that's not Gen AI? How do you determine whether you're going to use that versus using OpenAI, for instance, and connecting to their model and their API? And what role does this play in determining go-to-market strategies, and have companies started using third-party solutions today? So I think it's a question of, if as part of this Gen AI hype cycle, right? If Gen AI is a hammer, everything is a nail, and everything has sort of become, oh, Gen AI can do that, Gen AI can do this, and it's like, well, it can, but there might be better options. There might be more stable options. There might be cheaper options. There might be better options. So how do you make that determination if you're an executive who's trying to accomplish some task that potentially could be a good fit for Gen AI, but potentially could be a good fit for a homegrown model or for something else? Yeah,
like I can't answer that question with like the right level of credibility, but I would add additional thoughts to that question, because it's the choice point and the trade-off is not just about which LLM should I use. It actually balloons up, because you can take that question and then you can say, well, if I'm going to make this LLM useful for my enterprise data, am I going to be fine-tuning this model? right? Am I taking off the shelf, GPT models, or am I going to fine tune a model myself? Well, what's the implications of fine tuning? Or should I actually just be enriching LLM responses at the point of inference with really rich user data, contextual data, instead of fine tuning? What's the trade-off there? And then you can take that question a step even further and say, hey, and this is something that Yori mentioned earlier, is an actual like LLM the right type of AI model to use here, or should we actually be looking at traditional supervised machine learning classification models in that sense? But a lot of these questions and trade-offs come down to cost, efficiency, and the effectiveness of the team being able to support it. And so there's no right answer, I think, in terms of answering this question, because it's very, very specific to how the implementation has to happen. But there are so many different trade-off decisions. And ultimately, that's what people are trying to figure out right now, is what is the right trade-off? How do I run these experiments and proof of concepts?
I'd also add latency is a key challenge. So if you want any sort of real-time interaction, that can be quite difficult. I mean, even like OpenAI's API will usually give you a second or two of delay. Maybe that's fine if it's a batch process. Maybe you need something a bit smaller and more local and faster. I would say it's almost certainly not worth training your own foundation model from scratch. It's just insanely expensive and difficult. But a lot of the model providers are now giving you more tools to customize. So to add fine tuning or context or RAG, like all of these things that you can do to sort of customize the model without actually training it from scratch. I'd say if you are interested in going the kind of home route, I would look at hosting an open source model like Meta's Llama rather than doing it from scratch. Yeah, I'd say traditional ML models can, and every time I've implemented those in companies, we have trained them from scratch. But that's also because the amount of training and the amount of data required is often much, much smaller.
I want to point that this is not a new question. The fact that we're asking this about LLM, it's not a new question. And I'm talking in AI. One of the first things when you are trying to do an LM is, okay, how does the data behave and which model works better? Do I need does neural network work better? Does a decision tree or an XGBoost logical or logistic regression works better? And a lot of this has to do with how the data behaves and also what kind of response I'm looking. So the way that people do this today, they look at the data, try to get a feel for the data, and then try to figure out, okay, grosso modo, which type of algorithm works better. I need topological data analysis, or I'll use neural networks. And then you dive in because there are multiple options between. So you just add more things here. For example, you look at BERT. BERT is not really good at the Gen AI, but it's really good at understanding a lot of complexity between different parameters. So if you have data that's extremely complex and you want an actual answer as opposed to a generative one, BERT is better than Llama or Open GPT. If you want a generative one, use a generative one. If a lot of the data is going to be completely proprietary and has nothing to do with a foundation one, use Hugging Face. Okay, so I'm saying that there are kind of you go down a short list to try to figure out what's your data, what you're trying to do, and what family of solution is a good fit. And then you go down to what John and David said, what's the cost, how much it's going to take, and so on. But it's the same process that exists today when a business executive summons say, hey, I want better conversion here. Okay, and then let's do AI on that. It goes to a team of experts that first try to figure out what's the data, this is what we're trying to do, what's the best type of model, and then you begin to drive in. It's just an extension.
I would just add one final thought on this part of the conversation that we haven't touched on yet, which is about vendor lock-in and about the balance and trade-off with flexibility, because we also see, and we're talking to our customers that are exploring different LLMs, they're exploring different embedding models. They want choice and flexibility. So it's important to prevent this notion of lock-in. Do you want to be locked into OpenAI's ecosystem? Do you want to have the ability and flexibility of choice of model selection? It's the same issue about data. Do you want all your data sitting in Databricks, or do you want it all sitting in Snowflake? Or do you want the ability to leverage different data sources for different use cases? And I think that same kind of paradigm also exists in the selection of the models.
Agree.
Yeah, great points. And we've got another good question in the chat. What's your perspective on the sales and licensing of data to train proprietary LLMs? And I take that a step further and ask, what do you think the implications of that are? I mean, there's already some lawsuits and things related to data that has been scraped that perhaps without permission or perhaps in violation of terms of service. There's lots of other data that may be, so validly sold or licensed. But, if all of that's sort of informing the proprietary LLM, what are the risks associated with that if you start leveraging that LLM? So I'll kind of leave that one open-ended for you guys to answer. I think there's a lot of directions you could go there, but an intriguing question in the chat. Who wants to start with that one?
Oh, it's so juicy. I mean, I think I'm not sure how many customers this generally applies to, and whether you would want to license your data to a third party or just use it yourself to make your own product better. I think for most companies that aren't, where, say, unstructured textual data is their main business model, like Reddit or Wikipedia, I wouldn't say it makes sense to give that data away, even, also because it's unlikely that there's going to be massive data volumes associated with that.
I think it's mostly a legal problem. And I think the closest, I tried to see what happened in previous scenarios like this. So the closest I can think of this is the question of deep linking, if anyone remembers. Can I have an aggregate website that links into other news sites? Who owns it? Okay, is this legal? Somebody says, hey, you're using my IP. The other said, hey, it's public. I'm just linking into yours. And the reality that it took, if I'm not mistaken, more than 2 decades for this to kind of become settled law on what you can and can't do. And that means that in the meanwhile, everybody that used that practice, and pretty much everybody did, were at legal risk. I think we're at the same point here, that it's very difficult to define, was this a fair use? If I scraped 2 million of your messages and did something, was this a fair use or not? Regardless of what the end user license agreement says. I think it's going to take quite a lot of lawsuits to figure that out on where is kind of this happens, and maybe some legislation. I don't think it stopped anyone before. You can see, I mean, I'm looking at deep linking. It did not stop aggregate websites. Feedly, RSS, there's so many different industries developed on that. It didn't, and I don't think it's going to slow it down. That said, some specific guys are going to pay some more cost because they're going to be litigated. Going to be litigation. So I think it'll continue with a risk.
Well said. Yeah, I agree. Well said, Yuri.
Thank you.
So we're running close on time, so I want to go ahead and jump ahead to our lightning round. So I'll just go around and ask each of you to share one key insight in a word or phrase about how Gen AI will reshape the nature of executive decision making, and you don't have to limit this to the short term. You want to think of, broadly and more long term. How do you see this playing out and what's sort of your key takeaway for the audience today? Why don't we start with you, David?
My takeaway here is this is kind of a contrarian point of view potentially, but everybody has access to the same models. Like everybody, right? So at this point, like general LLM like responsiveness and accuracy, it's the same, it's normalized, it's democratized. And that actually means that the ability to actually utilize an LLM in a production environment is not differentiated on its own. And the takeaway for organizations has to be, how do you leverage your proprietary data in a meaningful way that could actually make your LLM responses better, more accurate, and drive a better customer interaction and experience? And I think my kind of, if I could say anything at all, it's to say, hey, think about the workflow. Think about the data engineering complexities associated with converting all this data from different data modalities and, activating that data, and think about the work. And if it's a little too much, come check us out. Come talk to Tecton, because we're doing some pretty cool stuff.
Great points. Thanks, David. John?
Yeah, so I think we're getting to the point where Gen AI is going to be surfacing opportunities proactively from the underlying data. So not just saying what happened, but why did it happen and what should you do about it? I definitely echo David's point about data quality, that your proprietary data is the real differentiator. Yeah, if you're interested, I know there was a question in the chat about, can we use Gen AI to actually help with data instrumentation? That's Snowplow's entire business model. So if you're curious about that, then also hit me up after this.
Thanks, John. And Yori, we'll give you the last word.
So the first thought when you said this for me was, that's just one more advice an executive can ignore. You get so many advices. Okay, it's one more. And then I thought, okay, what would make them not ignore it? If they really understand the credibility of what Gen AI does, that, which means that the executive that take another step and understand what is the data behind, what was the monitoring or the grounding of what you did with the Gen AI, and this basically a good solution for that problem, yeah, then I can use that. So if you actually do some of your own question and develop some critical thinking on, can I rely on this, or at what level I can rely on this, executive that will develop that level of critical thinking will be able to say, hey, these 5 tools I completely ignore, but this one tool I should listen to. So basically, it's the executive that understand the limitation and benefits of Gen AI can actually they'll gain a very smart or somebody assistant that can be priceless. But if they don't, it's just one more thing that creates noise for them. It's a skill that need to be learned, and that's it's not an easy one, because you can't just look what other people did. You need to figure that out.
Yeah, great points. And I just to echo all of that, I think educating people about the limitations and the benefits, very important. I think as we see lots of different use cases and potential in this, education of everybody in the organization from the top down, very critical to making sure that we use these tools effectively. So thank you to all of our panelists again today. Really enjoyed the discussion. If you missed any of the webinar today, you want to rewatch anything, the recording will be available a few minutes after the webinar if you refresh this page. And want to say a special thank you again to all of our partners at Matillion, Snowplow, Sqream, and Tecton for making this webinar possible. Thank you again. We'll see you next time.